Well, I'm glad you're back because we had to stop right in the middle of a story last week, and that's a tragedy on all levels. Matthew 15, verse 34 is where we're starting. But just to remember, Jesus has been, he sat on a mountainside. People came to him, and he just healed and healed and healed and healed. Then he told his apostles, I have compassion for these people because they've been here 3 days. They don't have any food. And the disciples said, well, where are we going to get that? After Jesus has already fed 5,000. He's going to feed 4,000 here. The same way. He said, how many loaves do you have? And, we have 7 loaves, a small fish they'd gathered. So it's not the same as the 5,000. There are people who believe this story only occurred once and it's told 2 different ways. I don't think so. Because in humanity, we very often have to have the same lesson pounded at us several times. And I think that's what's going on here. He told the crowd to sit on the ground, and he took the 7 loaves and fish. When he'd given thanks, he broke them, gave them to the disciples. They in turn to the people. This sounds so familiar. They all ate and were satisfied. Afterward, the disciples picked up 7 basketfuls, very familiar, different number, of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was 4,000 men, besides women and children. After Jesus had sent the crowd away, he got into the boat and went into the vicinity of Magadan. So, sign, drumming into the disciples, you've got to trust this. Trust what? The food will magically appear? No, he's saying, do what you can. You go get the food you can, and then we'll talk about whether or not we can feed these people. But you got to go get the food. You need to engage and be a part of the process of what God is doing. This is why Paul refers to us as being fellow laborers with God, co-workers with God. God says, go into all the world. He doesn't say, you guys chill. I'm going to go into all the world and take care of this. Could he? Yes. But he chooses to work with us. Think of Philip and the queen's treasurer, often called the Ethiopian eunuch. I do believe he'd probably prefer the queen's treasurer to be remembered that way. When the Holy Spirit takes Philip and then puts him there to where he can see the treasurer's chariots going by, he says, you go join yourself there and you teach him. So the angel miraculously took him from where he was to where the treasurer was, but the angel didn't do the teaching. He told the guy, go for it. He wants us, men and women, boy and girl, to engage and be a part of the process. That's why it's very, very important to be involved in charitable work and to take your family with you. Let the kids fold the clothes, clean the clothes, help them see how to feed the poor. Let them see what you do with your money and to be involved in the charitable work that you do. And then, by the way, let us know about it. Now, this isn't one of those, if you give to be seen of men, then you have no. By telling us the stories, you encourage us to do more of the same. And so send us a note. Tell us what 501c3 charities you're involved with in your area, because we really want to know what it is, whether it is supporting homeless veterans in New Jersey, which one of our young ladies is our minister to them. We help that. Whether it is supporting women who are pregnant and need help with their babies in Northeast Missouri, we are involved with that. Or whether it's feeding people here locally, actually through One General Way, feeding people all over the states, we do that. So, but let your kids be a part of it. Have them be involved in it. God has called us all to be involved, so we teach them early. Now, he went to the vicinity of Magadan, and the Pharisees and Sadducees, oh boy, they're back, came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. In other words, you've been doing all these miracles. Everybody's been talking about the miracles. 4,000 guys and their families that got fed there, and all the healings have been done here. Well, let's just see if you really are from God. Do some miracles for us. Last week, I referenced the old musical Jesus Christ Superstar, and that was another song on that soundtrack that really hit me. And it's King Herod demanding a sign from Jesus. And it's sung in a comical way, but it's not taken comically by anybody that really pays attention. Saying, hey, I've been looking forward to, and Herod did. I've been looking forward to seeing you. Do some signs for me. God is not your puppet. He's not your dog that reacts and does tricks because you want him to. No. So he replied, when evening comes, you say it'll be fair weather, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. Wow. Wow. You know how to read the weather, but you haven't paid attention to what's going on around you. I don't think it is very healthy for us to consume a lot of news during the day, because no matter where you get your news from, it's slanted, it's skewed, and some things are put in and some things are put out. You might sample bits of different news through the day, but we do need to know a bit of what's going on. We don't need to be caught off guard all the time. So we know a bit, and we look at the signs of the time, we adjust our prayers and behavior accordingly. They were believing that doing their actions, their processes, their procedures, their traditions, that would bring about a world that they wanted without paying attention to the world that was really there. He says, a wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah. Then he left them and walked away. What? What does that mean? Well, we know because we know the end of the story. Nobody he just said this to knew. We know the end of the story. Jesus was in the tomb 3 days. Jonah in the belly of the fish 3 days. Jonah comes out alive. Jesus comes out alive. It's a bigger miracle because Jesus actually died. That's the sign he's talking about. You're going to get a sign. You're not going to like the sign you get because it's going to end you. It's going to end your whole concepts, your whole group. They went across the lake. The disciples forgot to take bread. Who's surprised? We've already seen it happen repeatedly. Be careful, Jesus said to them. Be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees. They didn't get it. I mean, why would they get it? Would you have gotten it? So they discussed it among themselves and said, it's because we didn't bring any bread. In other words, be careful that you don't get bread from those guys. That's what they got from this. Aware of their discussion, you can almost see Jesus going, you have little faith. Why are you talking among yourselves about having no bread? Do you still not understand? Don't you remember the 5 loaves for the 5,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? Or the 7 loaves for the 4,000 and how many basketfuls you gathered? How is it that you don't understand that I was not talking to you about bread, but be on your guard against the yeast of the Pharisees and Sadducees? Then they understood that he was not telling them to guard against the yeast used in bread, but against the teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees. All right. We first came to America, the area we lived in Ohio for about 9 years. And the families around then were really big into the homemade bread. And by the way, it smells up the house something beautiful. It is amazing. And it tastes great. But it was labor intensive. And sometimes when people left home for a while, a vacation or work had called them away, they would go over to a trusted friend and say, here's my starter. Can you keep my starter alive for me while I'm gone? And they would. It was almost a cult. It was a big deal there. But a cult I thoroughly enjoyed because it was tasty. I learned a lot about yeast and how little you need, but it's an active living thing, yeast is. A unicellular thing, which we really need. And a little bit's all you need. All of us have had bread, whether homemade or not, that didn't taste right because it had too much yeast. And if it doesn't have enough yeast, it doesn't rise. And it becomes a flatter, harder bread. So he's saying, don't even let a little bit of this attitude get in you. My dear Christian friends on Twitter, on Discord, Reddit, wherever you are. I don't know why you'd be on Reddit or anyway. Wherever you are, the attitude shoved at you by the algorithm are fierce and very determined and very sure of themselves. Be careful you don't let any of those that have no justification or no Christ in them take root as a little bit of yeast, because it will grow. There's a thing in human eyes called generalization and confirmation bias. If, for example, you were to say, all purple people are lazy, you just had somebody say that, and you're thinking, I'm not sure that's true. I'll just pay attention. You're going to see more and more purple people being lazy because you've heard something. Now you start looking for it. And when you start looking for things, you find them. That's not always true. Looking for a girlfriend doesn't mean you're going to get one. But you get my point. You will start noticing things more often. For example, if you are a gambler, that's the way they work. They're walking somewhere and they see this big address that says 313, and they're thinking, that's the lottery numbers I got to put in there now. And because everywhere I looked, I saw another 3 or 1 or a 3. It's because you were looking. That's why you saw it. And confirmation bias means I looked, I saw it, therefore it must be true. It's the same thing as when on television I might say, I took this particular vitamin and now I have more energy than ever. Maybe, but more likely you were paying more attention to your energy level. You had invested money in the vitamin, therefore you're invested in this working. It's called confirmation bias, all right? Here, yeast, those little ideas can start making us look for things, and then it grows, and then we got to back it up. Purple people are not only lazy, but we really think they're having too many babies and that they're probably evil too. And you start, it all starts working like this. Be very careful. Trace it. Whatever thought you're having, trace it, face it, and if necessary, erase it. That's a therapeutic model for you. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, who do people say the Son of Man is? Now he's referring to himself. It's a weird way to refer to yourself. In our language, not to them. Son of Man was not a religious title at this point, although it was becoming one because of Christ's life. It really means this guy, this person. Who do they say I am? Because he wasn't saying, who do they say that I, the Son of God, co-equal with the Father and the Spirit? He doesn't say that because he comes to us with the most common name in the first century. Jesus, Jacob, and Joseph are basically the same name back then. It was certainly related. And so he's just saying, who are people saying that this guy walking around is? They replied, some say John the Baptist. Others say Elijah. And still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets. Why would they say that? Aren't those people all dead? Yes, but Elijah didn't technically die. He was caught up into heaven. So there were prophecies that Elijah would come back. There were prophecies and ideas that John the Baptist would come back. And Jeremiah, that voice crying in the wilderness that, some people said, well, that's kind of Jesus. He's always in the wilderness, and he's always calling us to repent and come back to God. Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. Now, the word Messiah means the anointed one, which means Peter really got it. He understood, you're not just that guy. You are the one sent to us from God. You are the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. You are the fulfillment of all the prophecies about our new king come from heaven to restore us. Jesus replied, blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. Then he ordered his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Messiah. We'll deal with verse 20 here in a bit. Now, our Catholic friends, who are our brothers and sisters, we do not speak evil of them, nor do we tolerate such. But they take this passage because they've been told to. They've been told to read it on its face as it comes across in English, or to be fair, most Western languages. And if you look upon it, it sure sounds like Peter and upon this rock. Why would he say, you are Peter? Well, the name Peter does mean rock. It means a little rock. And then he says, and upon this rock, it's a bigger rock. But it doesn't look that way unless you know the Greek. And therefore, it looks like he's saying, I'm going to build my church on Peter. And that's where the Catholic get the idea of Peter being the first pope. Even though Peter was not from Rome, and as far as we can tell historically, never lived there, never preached there, but was taken there to be executed. That's historically accurate. We, with all due respect, disagree that that's what's being said here. He's saying, Peter, this has not been revealed to you by people. God gave this to you, and blessed are you. I like you, Peter. You got it. Now you are Peter, a little rock, but upon this rock, I am the Son of God, the Messiah, the large rock, the foundation-sized rock. I will build my church, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now, here's where versions matter. There was a version, and the New American Standard Version is a great version. The old American Standard Version of 1901 was so accurate when it came to verbs that it was difficult to read, and so it never really caught on. The other problem was it was a supremely accurate translation of a text that wasn't a really good text. And so they had to update the text with better manuscripts, older manuscripts, and sort that out. That said, it's still good to have a copy of the 1901 American Standard Version around just so that you can look at the verbs. And the verbs here, they get it right. I'll give you the keys of the heaven. Whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven. And whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. You see how that changes everything? And by the way, that's very accurate. That is better voicing of the verbs used here. So it's not saying, Peter, whatever laws you make up, that's what we'll do. Now, Jesus has actually come pretty close to saying that about all of us. He said, when you agree about something on earth, my Father in heaven and I will agree with you. This is a give and take. Come, let us reason together. This is a deal that God has made with us to work with us in the unfolding of his kingdom. It does not, in my opinion, say anything about Peter being the head and Peter making the rules. Although Peter absolutely was the spokesman, which is referred to as the first preacher in Acts chapter 2, we see that Peter stayed within the Jews. Paul went to the Gentiles. So there was no later effect that showed that anybody thought Peter was the head of the church. Not until a couple hundred years later did that idea start to filter, and it really never started getting really firmed in until after Constantine. Now, I do want to bring up another issue here. The gates of Hades. Hades means the realm of the dead. It doesn't mean hell. It doesn't mean what we think of as Gehenna or any of these other. By the way, those of you who are not aware of this, we are just now starting a series on Sunday morning. I believe the 28th, well, not the 28th, but around 21st is going to be the first one. But look, around the third or fourth week in August will be the first one. And it's going to be called Hell and Heaven and a God of Love. And basically, what happens after we die? What is hell? What is heaven? What happens? What have we got right? What have we got wrong? And if you've been listening to us for years, you already know there's going to be some discussion about what we got wrong. But Hades was a catch-all term for after death. And it would include paradise. It would include Tartarus or torment. It would include all of those ideas around Hades. although the man is not a Christian, and in fact is he refers to it as a happy agnostic. Some people think he's more of an atheist than not. Bart Ehrman's book on the history of heaven and hell is actually very, very instructive, informative on the ideas that were being bandied about at this time and widely accepted about what hell is. When I was a boy, I read this mainly out of King James or the 1901 American Standard Version, and therefore I read that the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And we were always in a defensive posture. You know, the Soviets may come across through the Fulda Gap or fire their missiles over the North Pole lattice, but they'll never be able to wipe out the church because the gates of hell cannot prevail against us. Wait, gates are not offensive. Gates are defensive. Here Jesus is not saying the devil and hell and death won't be able to overwhelm you. He's saying you will overwhelm death and hell and Satan. Their gates can't stand up to us. Changes everything once you realize what you've just read. Yeah, we're not supposed to be defensive, hunkered down in some sort of fetal position, just hanging on to hope that that the bad won't wipe us out. No, we go out there and we defeat death. We defeat Satan. We defeat hell. He says they won't be able to prevail against you. That's superb news. So now he's made it known to them who he is, that they get it, that this is going to be a partnership between heaven and humanity. And then he says, don't tell anybody about this yet. Well, why? Why would you do such a thing? Well, the Bible's never explicit about this. And so please mark this with a red flag that this is Patrick doing some supposition. Not the first time that's happened, but I do try to let you know. I believe it's because if they go out in the most fiercely monotheistic culture that was known at that time and start saying, this guy is God, the Son of God, the anointed of God, the chances of the cross happening way too early occur. He needs a few years, between 3 and 4 years, to get his followers ready, and then he dies for all of us. He doesn't need the mob coming for him right now. He's not afraid of death. Well, I think everybody's afraid of the dying process. And certainly if you knew it was going to be by the cross, there is fear involved there. And I think we can see that in some of Jesus's behavior. But his courage was far greater than his fear. And his determination was far greater than his fear. And so he's determined to get there, but he wants to get his work done before that happens. And of course, his greatest work is done on the cross and from the empty tomb. So that's why I think he's telling them. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. So now he is not hiding it from them. He is opening this up to them, letting them know this is going to happen. And there's nothing you can do to stop it. It's going to happen. Now, Peter, who he just said had done good stuff, gets riled up by this. Peter took him aside. Hey, God, you and I need to talk a little bit. I need to straighten you out on a thing or two. I love it that the people in Scripture are gasp people. And that they get it right and they get it wrong. And sometimes comically wrong. And began to rebuke him. Peter's rebuking Jesus, saying, never, Lord, this will never happen to you. And Peter was not expecting what he got. Jesus turned and said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. Whoa. The last couple of weeks, we've seen some really harsh things said by Jesus. You know something? If you've got a big job to do, it's super important. Time is of the essence, and you know a horrific thing is coming your way. It does sharpen the language to where you're not able to be as flowery and as gentle as you'd like. you need blunt. Now, why would he call him Satan? Satan means accuser. Well, Jesus is saying, this must happen. Peter goes, no, it doesn't. And he's saying, are you saying I'm a liar? Are you saying I'm wrong? You just thought I was the anointed one, the Son of God. Are you now saying I've got it wrong, Peter? Who are you to say this? So he has every right to say, you're accusing me. Get out of my sight. That's what get behind me means. And then he says, you don't have in mind the things of God. You have in mind human concerns. How many more missionaries could we send into the field, and how many more people could we feed if we weren't so concerned about our human concerns? About we need our pantry to be more full, we need our bank account to be more full. We need you know this, we all know this, and I'm not trying to dig for your dollars here. You also know that we appreciate every penny sent in because it literally feeds us. But we don't beg, and we don't push you, and we don't guilt trip you. But I'm in the mix here, we very often don't move until we're comfortable, and we never get comfortable enough to move. I know of some men called to the mission field, and I know of some women called to the mission field who could not go to the mission field because their spouse liked their stuff too much to put it in storage and go, or to sell it and go, or didn't like this, that, or the other. Now, quite frankly, if you have a spouse, you're supposed to work together. So I'm not saying, leave them and go, or they're a bad person. I'm just saying, be aware it's a human tendency to grab onto what we have and say, I'll go and do more when we have more. Jesus is saying, I got something to do. And you need to let me go and do it. And you need to buy in because it's not optional. Then Jesus said to his disciples, whoever wants to be my disciple must deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. I cannot explain adequately how shocking this would be. If you were to take somebody born around the time of Jesus or any time 300 years before and bring them into our society, and they're driven around your town, and they see crosses on buildings, and then they see people wearing a cross, or even a cross tattooed on them, you would have no ability to explain to them that this is a good thing. The Romans at times would crucify hundreds of people, and they would do it right by the road, not off the road, not on a hill like we see in the pictures sometimes, far from the people. But if it's on a hill, it's because the road went that way. They would put it right there, and we see crosses being really high in the paintings. They were not high. Your feet were generally 1 to 2 feet off the ground. And then lean forward. So as people are walking, you're right there, writhing in pain, sweating and bleeding right there, screaming in pain, and they would line the roads with them. It was the most horrific death that they could imagine. Therefore, that's the death that they decreed. Why? Because they wanted people to know who was in charge, and it was Rome and not them. And so, whenever Spartacus or anybody else rebels against them, they would kill not only that person, but a bunch of people around them. And they could be random. They'd just go into the crowd and start grabbing people. And those people would be crucified. There was no trial, no human rights, no Bill of Rights, no Charter of Human Rights, nothing like that. You were just tortured to death in front of everybody for a lesson. And now Jesus is looking at his apostles, who one of them just said, no, you can't do this. You can't go and die. And look at them and say, you can't follow me unless you pick up that cross, because that's going to be what happens if you follow me. Now, for most of us, I'm very happy to say, we will never be nailed to a tree. We'll never be stoned to death. Still does happen. I don't know of anybody that still actively crucifies except for warlords in some places. And the Islamic armies often loved crucifying the Christians when they came upon an area, because they didn't, in the Quran, they don't believe that Jesus was crucified. And so they're going, oh, you worship the cross? Well, you get nailed to one like him then. And that I don't think happens very often, again, except for various warlords. But there are people who have lost their lives. And in fact, more Christians are being killed for their faith now than at any time in human history since the Roman times. Yet it doesn't make the news because it's not important. In Nigeria alone, over 100,000 in recent years have been kidnapped, raped, forced into marriages, or murdered because they were Christians. And scores of churches set aflame, and yet it never makes our news. It's just not important enough to our news people to bring that up. It's tragic. Jesus tells us you have to be willing to pick up that cross. Now, that cross, for many of us, is probably not the death, like I said, but it is self-denial. It is discipline. It is walking within the guardrails that God set for us, however imperfectly we might do so. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for me will find it. As one poet said, a coward dies 1,000 deaths. A brave man dies but once. The Bible in the book of Hebrews lauds some people because it says they did not love their lives so much as to shrink from death. Always wondered that. The TV series in the Americas called 24 was about a super agent that got things done in 24 hours. And it was always some massive big thing. It wasn't somebody who was going to knock off the local Family Mart. It was always, a nuclear codes to blow up the world. And they would put a gun up against somebody, give us the codes. Well, they're not going to do it. So they'd shoot somebody in the foot, and then I'm not going to do it. They'd put a gun to their head, and they'd say, okay, here are the codes. And that always amazed me. Why would you give them the codes to save your life when they're going to fire off nuclear missiles and kill tens of millions of people, including you? Now, maybe that's a cheap and unfair thing for me to say because I've not had a gun against my head and been shot in the foot. I don't think I would give them the codes. I've had people say, what if they held the gun on your wife or on your children? Hey, that'd be a lot harder. But at the same time, Christians have a different view of death. We don't die on purpose. We don't commit suicide and kill others. But we're not so afraid of death that we're going to drop our faith as a rule. Now, it's a lot easier if somebody put a gun up to your head and say you're not a Christian anymore, to say I'm not a Christian, than to give them nuclear codes. I get that as well. So don't overblow this illustration. Just remember this. Don't love your life so much that you end up losing your soul because of it. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world and yet forfeit their soul? Or what can anyone give in exchange for their soul? For the Son of Man is coming in his Father's glory with his angels, and then he will reward each person according to what they have done. I've had people say, wait a minute, that sounds like works religion. If you try to do faith only, James says, not by faith only. If you try to do works salvation, Paul makes it very plain, no, that doesn't do it. There's always a blend. Because of your faith, you will do certain things. I'm not a Christian because I do what I do. I do what I do because I'm a Christian. Your faith produces works. James doesn't say that your faith means nothing. He says faith without works is dead. Your faith needs to show outside. And Jesus is saying, I'm coming with my angels. He says elsewhere, don't be afraid of those who can kill the body. Be afraid of the one who can kill the body and the soul. He says, I'm coming. Remember that. Remember who's in charge, ultimately. And then he says to them, truly I say to you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. This verse will be very, very important when we get another 8 or so chapters further down the road. And the Olivet Discourse is given. But the kingdom of God doesn't mean heaven necessarily. It means the church and the Christian community and the life of faith right here, right now. And Jesus brought it at great cost to himself and great benefit to us. We have to leave it there. One of my favorite stories comes next, but due to the limits of time, that means it comes next week. Thank you for being with us. Thank you for those who give, support, and those that subscribe and share. Amazing. That's a huge help to us. God bless you. We'll see you soon.